of othering in coloniality that is religious difference. So this is where my kind of interest coalesces with the main questions of this symposium. And what I'm focusing on is basically how the rise in geopolitical importance that Western Christianity experienced starting at the end of the 15th century, both in Europe and around Europe, prompted discourses of difference centered on religious identities. And in some previous work, I identified several patterns of this types of differentiations, but what is a kind of mainstay of the literature on this topic is a focus on Europe's Atlantic expansion. So how religious difference was created basically in the context of colonialism, in the context of enslavement, and how that shaped religious difference and religious identities on both sides of the Atlantic. What I want to focus on that is the fact that this Atlantic focus kind of leaves aside the history of East Central Europe. And by focusing on the concept and the reality of coloniality centered on European colonialism, what gets neglected is the history of imperiality, the legacy of empire, but also what has been called Inter-Imperiality by Laura Doyle. And I will go into that a little bit, what she means, because it's a central concept for what I'm trying to do. And I'm going to look especially at the example of Transylvania as what I think is a paradigmatically inter-imperial space because of its location at the crossroads of the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, and the Ottoman empires, in order to illustrate the dynamics of religious othering that I think can be seen to lead to the crystallization of national religions well into the 20th century. So the fact that I'm starting in the 15th century doesn't mean that we won't get closer to today, hopefully earlier than in 40 minutes. All right, so the one pattern that I'm going to focus on from among the different ones in modernity coloniality is the one that I've recently referred to as Conquest Modernity, starting from more or less the crucial year 1492, crucial in several respects, and spanning at least 2 centuries after that, which is basically a period in which spatial racialization was dominant. So the idea of othering religious difference happened through a spatial distance from the one that was being othered, including expulsions, including the death of the religious other. And this is obviously not only starting with the Christian Reconquista of Islamic Spain, also 1492, and the European discovery of the Americas, same year. But that basically set the stage for a reconfiguration of Western European Christian identity. And so the discourses on difference started being centered on religious identities. That meant Christians, and that was, we're talking here about Iberian colonizers and obviously Catholic Christians, defined themselves as people with the right religion, and in contradistinction, Jews and Moors were gradually racialized. This is not only a policy of spatial racialization, removal, expulsion, but it has to do with the limits of the Western imaginary, the Western Christian imaginary. So basically imagining the other as being in a different space has consequences for what it means to have even a population classified as religious and others as non-religious. So basically the indigenous populations of the Americas that were seen as people with no religion because their religious beliefs did not correspond to anything that the colonizers could identify. So they were relegated to the space and also the category of people with no religion. And there's a host of literature on that. I'm just gonna leave the names up here, Mignolo, Maldonado Torres, as well as Ella Shohat and Robert Stam. In that same context, the idea of having people without religion in the colonized spaces that could be Christianized or should be Christianized, so the mission of the colonizers was salvation, implied that the Africans enslaved for the European transatlantic trade could be seen and were seen after the infamous debate in Valladolid in 1550 as lacking a soul altogether, so that their death as a consequence of slavery could be written off as not being a sin, even in a Catholic Christian imaginary. So this entire framework, on which, again, there's a lot of work done, is mostly within the framework of coloniality, decoloniality. And for those of you not familiar with the concept, coloniality refers to a continuation of racial, ethnic, but also economic and epistemic hierarchies after the end of colonialism, which reproduced the same hierarchies of during colonialism, so were based on them, but in the absence of colonial administration. So coloniality refers to that framework in which we still live under a reality shaped by these kinds of hierarchies. Now, among other things, I guess that framing the type of religious othering, at least during Conquest Modernity, results not in a map of multiple modernities, and there's another big literature on that, but rather in multiple alterities produced through what I think are successive and cumulative strategies of racialization and ethnicization. And I know that's abstract, but that's not part of what interests us most here, because our focus is East and Central Europe. And what I want to argue here is that this whole rich debate and the entire framework still is an incomplete one in order for us to understand religious difference and religious othering, even for that same period, if we do not take into account East and Central Europe. And in order to do that, I'm using the concept of Inter-Imperiality, again, coined by Laura Doyle, who's a literary scholar, but in collaboration and dialogue and debate with both world systems analysis and world history, and conceives of Inter-Imperiality as a legacy of empire born out of the conflict of overlapping and conflictive empires. So I'm going to say a little bit more about it in a minute, but just to say the main argument here is that in East and Central Europe, inter-imperiality both precedes coloniality, so it starts before the European colonial expansion and coexists with it, so that inter-imperiality is a category and a force still with us today, that it basically shaped both the patterns of religious othering and the racial ethnic othering at the intersection of Christianities in the plural, which is what the literature on coloniality does not consider much. It always talks about Christianity, or Western Christianity at least, but not Christianities. But the intersection of Christianities, Judaism, and Islam is being shaped by inter-imperiality well into the 20th century. And I'm going to look at Transylvania as this paradigmatically inter-imperial space at the crossroads of the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, and the Ottoman empires. In order not to take credit for this whole focus, I have to disclose that this is drawing on work together with my colleague and co-author Anca Părvulescu from the Washington University in St. Louis, with whom we have just completed a book on the topic of Transylvania and inter-imperiality. And these are two recent articles that are drawing from that work, and both very closely related to the argument here. One, called Creolizing Transylvania, regards the imbrication of coloniality and inter-imperiality, and another one, more from Anca Părvulescu's literary perspective, looks at what we have been also focused on in the manuscript, which is a 1920 Transylvanian novel written and published in the year of the Treaty of Trianon, which is both symbolically, politically, and geopolitically very important for the region, but also the history of Transylvania and its inter-imperiality. Now, that word has come up again, and I still haven't explained it, so let me do that. In 2013, Laura Doyle had already started kind of exploring the notion of inter-imperiality as a critique of mainstream post-colonial approaches by saying that, you know, we continue to make, this is the quote up there, the oddly Eurocentric assumption that Western European imperialism accounts for all recent imperialism, with the concomitant misperception that all territory is either a European post-colony or uncolonized. And that, of course, prompted the whole debate around whether or not post-colonial approaches can be applied to East Central Europe because they hadn't been colonized, and so on and so forth. Her suggestion and her call, basically, together with others, some like Xu Meishu and Françoise Lyonnais, was that post-colonial studies should be looking also at non-West European empires, not only the so-called Eastern empires, but the Mughal Empire together with the Ottoman Empire, the Russian one, Japan, and China, which does for us, and for me especially, a methodological trick. It's a shift in attention that renders various parts of East Europe legible as inter-imperial spaces, whereas until then, they were just awkward fits with both post-colonial studies and different types of modernization theory, different types of kind of standards into which East Central Europe was kind of always the exception. Now, I'm arguing that Transylvania is one such inter-imperial site because of its location at the crossroads of empire, but that also that location and that history, together with the present that resulted from that inter-imperial history, poses a lot of challenges for both historiography and post-coloniality, as well as our understanding of religion and religiosity. So starting with several imperial layers, which are necessary to even speak about inter-imperiality, right? We have to have more than one imperial history and more than one imperial legacy. It could be argued that the first imperial layer in the history of the region, and this is now a 20th century projection of what Transylvania has been as a region and how it's been incorporated into the nation state of Romania in the 20th century, but it goes back a long time. The first imperial layer goes back even to the Roman Empire, the late 1st century, with Napoca, what is today the city of Cluj-Napoca, or Koloshvar, being the name of a Roman fort and later a Roman colony. Now, we could say, why do we even go back to the 1st century in order to discuss inter-imperial conflicts that had to do with much later empires? The curious thing, but maybe not so curious, about narratives of national belonging and of national identity since the 18th century in Romania, in Transylvania's, Romanians' claims to Transylvania as belonging have been anchored in an influential narrative of territorial and linguistic continuity with the land since the Roman province of Dacia. So basically, that first imperial layer is still invoked as belonging to the family of Romance languages, the Latin-speaking territory of the Roman Empire. So basically, if Transylvania is an inter-imperial space, the Romanian national narrative is a witness to a desire for the classicist longue durée of Roman imperiality and for kinship with the Romania, so the concept of Romance languages, not the country Romania, but the concept of Latin speaking and Romanity, so to say. But there's more. Going into more well-known modern history, Transylvania has existed as a geopolitical entity since at least the 15th century, and there we have kind of a temporal match to coloniality, but it has never become a state. Well, it had independence for a month, but that almost doesn't count. Instead, Transylvania has been claimed serially by a number of empires and nation states, and has maintained a separate identity within the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg Empire, but ceased to exist in 1867 when it was incorporated into the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and once again in 1918 when it was incorporated into Romania. And since 1918, it's been a historical province within the Romanian nation state. Larry Wolff has referred to Transylvania as the category of extinct geopolitical entities, and in that he was drawing a parallel to Galicia, which for him had had a similar history. So in that sense, the study of Transylvania contributes to what I think is a singular perspective on the imbrication of nation building, post-coloniality, and inter-imperiality. Moving on in time, in the 16th and 17th centuries, Transylvania was then situated at the crossroads that have defined its inter-imperiality, and at the same time at the crossroads of the empires that dominated East Central Europe. And you can see their modified map from the Historical Atlas of the Romanian Academy, mapping basically the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and then also Poland-Lithuania. It's not well visible as such there, which was itself in tension with Russia. And basically, Transylvania was administratively divided in three parts, one under Istanbul's direct rule, one under Habsburg control, but paying tribute to the Ottoman Porte, while the third, well, Transylvania became a nominal vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. There's an entire kind of imbricated, complicated history about direct and indirect control from Istanbul, but basically for a while, Transylvania also had its own kind of administration, still paying tribute. So a shifting in and out of control from the Sublime Porte. If we're moving into what interests us in terms of division and redistribution of Transylvania's belonging and nationality together with religion at the historical landmark year of 1920, this is when Transylvania was internationally recognized as part of Romania by the Treaty of Trianon, and also the year when the novel that we had been working on, Anca Podopulescu and I, was published, looking at Transylvania from the standpoint of a village in which religious, political, and ethnic conflict are rife, and they kind of mirror what is happening at the larger geopolitical level. This makes it an entry point into Transylvania as an inter-imperial case study, with various temporal scales that involve both the Hungarian Kingdom, the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then, as well as the expansionist impulses of Greater Romania, the national project aimed at uniting Romanian-speaking people into one nation. And if we look at this map by, oops, I think you can't see the source. So this is from Andrea Comnosi in the book Nationalizing Empires by Stefan Bergen and sorry, forgot the author. And it shows the languages and nationalities in the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy at 1910, so 10 years before the Treaty of Trianon. And obviously it's not a very easy to read map. So here's a zooming into it. The languages and nationalities then appear as more easily legible. And you have the orange component is the Romanians, yellow Magyars, and then very visible in the map would be also the German minority. And if you see in the legend of the map, it's small there, nationalities / religious confession according to the census of 1910. So keeping in mind that it's orange, yellow, and red that we're looking for, this is, yes, this is how basically zooming into Transylvania looks like from a linguistic, national, and religious component at the moment that the map was drawn according to the census, which means there was a very long history of migration and of religious and ethnic differentiation in Transylvania. But at that moment, at the turn of the 20th century, there are at least 7 confessions in Transylvania. And you see that from the kind of circles that are a bit more fragmented than just the 3 colors I mentioned. You have Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Greek Catholic, Calvinist, Evangelical Lutheran, Unitarian, and Judaic. 2 denominations serve Transylvanian Romanians. That's the Greek Orthodox and Greek Catholic. Transylvanian Hungarians are primarily Roman Catholic and Calvinist, with Lutheran and Unitarian religious minorities, while Transylvanian Saxons are primarily Lutheran with a Calvinist minority. Jews belong to the Judaic faith. There are Orthodox Jewish communities and Reform communities. There are a small number of secular Sabbatarians who practice Judaism, and there are also significant atheist populations, nominally just belonging to each of these groups. Now, at the same time, this history of multi-confessionalism is, it sounds, or it was descriptive the way I've just presented it, but it's concomitantly a history of conversion and a history of conflict as such, that moves between these confessional options in a way along the lines of the subjects negotiating their identity positions vis-a-vis a number of inter-imperial power configurations. And that again goes back to the 16th century, where the Reformation saw conversions from Roman Catholicism to Lutheranism, Calvinism, and Unitarianism. And the Counter-Reformation during the 17th and 18th centuries saw conversions back to Catholicism. Some Greek Orthodox believers converted to Greek Catholic Church, some converted back again. Some Roma people assimilated into the Orthodox, Greek Catholic, and Roman Catholic churches. And this is significant because the Roma population in Transylvania had also a history of migration, not only hundreds of years ago coming into Europe, but coming into Transylvania also from neighboring Veliky and Moldavia, where the Roma population had been enslaved, both by the crown, by the church, and by the boyars. So the history of a free population in Transylvania that had a history of enslavement gets translated and re-subordinated in different ways because of the history of enslavement. So some Orthodox Armenians, historically Coptic Orthodox, converted to Roman Catholicism, and obviously conversion often marked a shift in the power structure more generally, or state control in particular. Interesting from a global and comparative perspective is the fact that conversion constituted a type of agency that allowed colonial and inter-imperial subjects to position themselves within a structurally unequal field of alternatives and negotiate their options in what was shifting inter-imperial terrain. So the meanings of modernity in this region are closely entangled with the politics of conversion that reflect the role that religion played in both inter-imperiality and coloniality. That means that the narrative that we normally get in terms of how Transylvania's multi-confessional history is framed can be at least be kind of questioned, or it can at least be marked with a question mark. The fact that Transylvania has been not only seen, but analyzed as the meeting place of the 3 Christian churches, Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox, and considered the birthplace of the concept of religious tolerance emerged during the Counter-Reformation can at least be inflected by an inter-imperial look or outlook on the history of Transylvania. If we look at the history of multi-confessionalism in Transylvania through an inter-imperial lens and a historical scale of the longue durée, we might be able to do more justice to the complexity of this particular region. If we look at the fact that some of the Jews of Transylvania are descendants of the Sephardic Jews expelled from Spain after the Catholic Reconquista, at the time when the Spanish Empire colonized the Americas. So there is a not surprising, but usually neglected kind of parallel there between the history of coloniality and the history of inter-imperiality. The Sephardic Jews traveled through the Balkans and settled in various places in the region along the way, so Transylvania is not the only one. Also, the fact that in this place, in Transylvania, Greeks, Armenians, and Jews engage in trade is an inheritance from the period of Ottoman domination in the Balkans. Armenians and Greeks were also considered foreigners and were discriminated against, but their discrimination was not premised on a history of anti-Semitism, which is why anti-Semitism becomes a specific kind of point of rupture between different minorities, religious minorities at that. For instance, there's a Romanian word for banker, cămătar, that is of Greek origin, but in the late 19th century, it came to be applied primarily to Jewish financial speculators, which is a process solidified by the reproduction of this stereotype then later on. It's of course a clear anti-Semitic trope. Now, if we look at this tripartite understanding of the global history of Christianity, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox meeting in one place that was Transylvania, and understand how coloniality gradually overrode the Ottoman imperial policy of religious tolerance in basically all conquered lands, and shaped the Counter-Reformation, then the idea of a haven of tolerance emerging in Transylvania gets at least a little bit blurred. But to make it more concrete, there were obviously clear internal limitations to how the so-called tolerance or toleration, there's both in the literature, basically, how that functioned. First of all, Greek Orthodoxy was not recognized as an accepted religion of the land. Basically, the tolerated status that it had prompted long-standing struggles over religious rights. At the same time, Orthodoxy was recognized in 1781 with Joseph II's Edict of Toleration. Judaism was in and out of periods of persecution and toleration, was granted legal status in Hungary only in 1895. And the history of the Roma, again, harks back to their history of enslavement in Wallachia and Moldavia, because once they were in Transylvania, they were required to forcefully assimilate, renounce their dress and their occupations, and attend Christian churches, which is a strikingly similar history and a strikingly similar kind of way of administering religious and ethnic difference to the one that Moors received in Spain when they had converted to Christianity. They also, the Roma people in Transylvania, were referred to as New Christians, the same phrase used in Habsburg Spain to refer to the converted Moors. And from that perspective, we remind ourselves, or we can remind ourselves of the critique that Ella Shohat formulated to the idea of tolerance by saying it is the reinforcement of a religious and social norm, not its absence. So the idea of Transylvania as a haven of tolerance has to do precisely with the existence of norms to which what was tolerated was the exception or was seen as deviant. And that is why, again, the inter-imperial history of Transylvania offers what can be considered a unique angle then into the history of Christianity and its global relation to Islam. Coming to an end, in order for us to have some time to discussion, maybe one concrete example of why it is important to discuss this history and this type of ethnic and religious difference within the framework of inter-imperiality regards what can be called relational racialization that Anka Podbolescu and I also analyze in the book. And that is the way anti-Semitism and anti-Roma sentiment were produced in relation to each other. So we're looking in the novel at situations in which the discrimination of the Roma is not matched by any type of gesture of solidarity from the Jewish minority in the village in which the novel takes place. That speaks to a perceived impossibility of Jewish Romani solidarity in the face of racism. Of course, not only in the novel, but that is only a kind of reflection of ethnic and religious relations at the time. So again, 1920. How inter-imperiality helps explain that perceived impossibility, because of course it would have been possible for one minority to fight at the same time for the rights of another, or to kind of coalesce interests. Inter-imperiality explains the impossibility of solidarity by a different type of religious difference. The history of enslavement of Roma people in Transylvania, but also in Romania more generally, translates in a wider framework of coloniality as colonial difference, the one colonial other that was seen as ontologically different from the colonizer. So that the claims to rights and political participation of Roma people in 1920s Transylvania are unthinkable from the point of view of political emancipation. You cannot have a politically emancipated people that is not considered to belong on the same scale of humanity as the ones whose rights they want to be equal with. So in the same way, and that itself is a whole discussion, the revolution of the enslaved in Saint-Domingue in Haiti in the beginning of the 19th century was something that has been theorized by anthropologists, and especially Michel Rolf-Trouillot, as the unthinkable revolution. It's unthinkable that enslaved can revolt. Well, the Roma in Transylvania were free, nominally free, but the idea of them claiming equal rights and political participation is still unthinkable in 1920s Transylvania, as the revolution of the enslaved Africans is in Saint-Domingue, Haiti, a century earlier. In contrast, the Jews' history of discrimination, and there's no attempt here to minimize that history in comparison, or to do kind of a comparison of discriminations or victimization here. But the Jews' history of discrimination in the region is inscribed in a different register. It is a kind of imperial difference. That is also a term coming from the colonial literature, where the imperial differences still recognizes the humanity of the other. It just considers them religious, from the religious point of view, to be wrong. They are the other that is wrong, that one can dominate, maybe, but human nonetheless. An imperial difference anchored in religion and in racializing religious customs, economic and social characteristics, all the tropes we know of anti-Semitism that have contributed and have been exacerbated to the point of the Holocaust in the 20th century are characteristics within an imperial difference that then, of course, with the Holocaust, went into a colonial one, went into a discourse of dehumanization. In 1920, the Jews in Transylvania had the edge over the Roma groups by having the possibility to negotiate their political claims in the emerging secular state, at least nominally, at least formally. It wasn't ideal, and it sure wasn't swift, but it was thinkable, in contradistinction with the possibilities awarded to Roma people. So basically, the racial and ethnic field at work here becomes more complex, and we can see that basically the possibility of integrating Transylvania into a wider system shaped by coloniality and inter-imperiality and its own kind of claim to being integrated both economically and politically into a wider Europe had a lot to do with reshuffling an ethnic and racial field, and in producing then afterwards a modern form of anti-Semitism that drew on coloniality as much as on inter-imperiality, and that would gradually erase that difference in the course of the 20th century.